They sued me for painting an American flag on my barn, on my land. But what they didn't count on was how far I'd go to defend my freedom. It all started with a simple act of patriotism. Living on my family's ranch in Texas, I've always felt a deep connection to this land and the values it represents: freedom, individuality, and pride in being an American. So when I decided to paint a large American flag mural on one side of my barn, it wasn't just about decoration. It was about expressing who I am and what this country means to me. The barn is visible from the road, and I thought it would be a symbol that could inspire others driving by. What I didn't anticipate was that this small gesture of love for my country would turn into a legal nightmare. You see, unbeknownst to me, the property I inherited from my grandfather years ago technically fell within the boundaries of a homeowners association, HOA. But here's the kicker: I never joined the HOA. In fact, no one in my family ever signed up or paid dues to them. Yet somehow, they claimed jurisdiction over my land and took issue with my flag mural. To say I was blindsided would be an understatement. This wasn't just about aesthetics or rules. It was about freedom of expression and whether someone else can dictate how I show respect for my nation. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when the mail arrived. Nothing out of the norm, just bills, catalogs, and a few flyers for local events. But nestled among the usual stack was something that immediately caught my attention: a certified letter from the Prairie View Homeowners Association. I hadn't ordered anything recently, nor had I been expecting any official correspondence, so curiosity quickly turned to concern as I tore open the envelope. Inside was a neatly typed document bearing the HOA's logo at the top, a bland insignia featuring some generic clip art of a house surrounded by trees, and beneath it, a formal complaint addressed to me. My eyes scanned the page, growing wider with each line. They were demanding that I remove the American flag mural I'd painted on my barn because it violated their architectural guidelines. At first, I thought it must be a mistake. Surely, they couldn't mean my barn. After all, I wasn't even aware there was such a thing as a homeowners association governing this part of town. This wasn't suburbia, it was ranch country, where people valued independence more than conformity. And yet, here it was in black and white: a sternly worded notice accusing me of making unauthorized alterations to my property. According to them, the mural disrupted the visual harmony of the community and failed to comply with their rules regarding exterior modifications. Visual harmony? What did that even mean? Were we living in Stepford or rural Texas? I read through the letter again, slower this time, trying to make sense of what I was holding. The tone was bureaucratic and impersonal, but there was no mistaking its intent. They wanted the mural gone, or rather, they wanted me to take it down, and they weren't asking politely. There was a deadline attached, 30 days, and a warning about potential legal action if I didn't comply. At the bottom of the page, someone had signed off with a flourish: "Sincerely, Patricia Wexler, President of the Prairie View HOA." I stared at her name, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. Who was this woman who felt entitled to dictate how I decorated my own barn? More importantly, who gave her, or anyone else, the authority to tell me what I could or couldn't do on land that had been in my family for generations? As the initial shock wore off, reality began to sink in. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a direct challenge to my autonomy. I tried to think back to when I'd ever agreed to follow the HOA's rules, but nothing came to mind. I certainly hadn't signed up for membership or paid dues. I barely knew these people existed. How could they claim jurisdiction over my property without my consent? It seemed absurd, almost laughable, except that the threat of legal consequences made it very real. I imagined lawyers in suits showing up at my door, ready to drag me into court over a painting. The whole situation felt surreal, like something out of a Kafka novel. Still reeling from the letter, I decided to call a friend of mine named Sarah, who happens to be a lawyer. She's sharp, pragmatic, and has always been good at cutting through red tape, so I figured she might have some insight into what was going on. When I explained the situation, her response was sobering. "Unfortunately," she said, "this kind of thing happens more often than you'd think. HOAs are notorious for being aggressive about enforcing their covenants, even against people who aren't officially members." She went on to explain that many associations operate under what's called mandatory membership, meaning anyone who owns property within their defined boundaries is automatically subject to their rules unless they actively opt out, which, in most cases, isn't possible once development begins. Sarah's explanation only deepened my frustration. Mandatory membership sounded less like a policy and more like extortion. If the HOA truly had jurisdiction over my land, simply because it fell within their designated zone, then what recourse did I have? Was I supposed to cave to their demands and erase the mural I'd worked so hard on? Or was there a way to fight back? Sarah assured me that I had options, but none of them were simple or cheap. Fighting the HOA would likely involve hiring an attorney, gathering evidence, and possibly going to court, an intimidating prospect for someone like me who'd rather spend his time fixing fences than arguing in front of a judge. Despite the daunting challenges ahead, one thing became clear. Backing down wasn't an option. For starters, removing the mural would feel like surrendering, not just to the HOA, but to the idea that individual expression should be sacrificed for the sake of conformity. Beyond that, giving in would set a dangerous precedent. If I let them bully me into compliance now, what would stop them from coming after me, or my neighbors, again in the future? Every time someone acquiesced to their demands, the HOA gained more power, chipping away at the freedoms that made owning property worthwhile in the first place. Over the next few days, I dove headfirst into researching the HOA and its history. A quick Google search revealed that the Prairie View HOA had only been established about a decade ago, long after my grandfather purchased the ranch. This discovery gave me a glimmer of hope. If the HOA came into existence after we already owned the land, surely their rules couldn't retroactively apply to us, right? To find out, I started digging through old deeds, titles, and other documents related to the property. It was tedious work, sifting through decades' worth of paperwork, but every scrap of evidence brought me closer to proving that I owed nothing to the HOA. While I was busy investigating, news of the dispute began to spread around the community. Neighbors stopped by unannounced, eager to share their thoughts. Some offered words of encouragement, while others expressed sympathy for the bind I was in. One man, whose family had lived nearby for years, told me he'd faced similar issues with the HOA. He recounted how they'd fined him repeatedly for minor infractions, like leaving his tractor parked too close to the road or failing to trim his hedges according to their exact specifications. Another neighbor confessed that she'd received a citation for planting sunflowers along her driveway because they weren't considered approved vegetation. Hearing these stories reinforced my belief that the HOA's policies were not only unreasonable, but also deeply invasive. What struck me most, however, was the sense of solidarity that emerged from these conversations. Up until now, I'd assumed I was alone in my resistance to the HOA's authority. But talking to my neighbors made me realize that plenty of people harbored similar grievances, they just hadn't spoken up before. Whether out of fear, apathy, or sheer exhaustion, they'd chosen to keep their heads down and avoid confrontation. Now though, seeing someone actually stand up to the HOA inspired them to voice their frustrations. Several neighbors promised to support me in whatever way they could, whether by attending hearings, signing petitions, or simply spreading the word. Knowing I had allies bolstered my resolve to see this fight through to the end. Meanwhile, the pressure from the HOA continued to mount. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, another letter arrived in the mail. This one was even more aggressive than the first, escalating the tone and doubling down on their demands. Not only did they insist that I remove the mural immediately, but they also threatened to impose daily fines until I complied. Worse still, they hinted at pursuing legal action if I refused. Reading between the lines, it was clear they were trying to intimidate me into submission. Their message was loud and clear: either play by their rules or face the consequences. The audacity of their threats left me fuming. Here I was, minding my own business, doing something as innocuous as painting a flag on my barn, and suddenly I was public enemy number one. Never mind that the mural represented everything good and noble about our country. It was apparently a visual disturbance that lowered property values and undermined the HOA's precious aesthetic standards. The hypocrisy was staggering. These were the same people who claimed to care about preserving the community's character, Yet they showed zero regard for the principles of freedom and self-expression that define America itself. By this point, I knew I couldn't tackle this issue alone. Armed with the information I'd gathered and the support of my neighbors, I reached out to a local attorney specializing in property law. His name was Mark Reynolds, and he came highly recommended by several people in town. During our initial consultation, I laid out the situation in detail, showing him copies of the letters I'd received and explaining my position. Mark listened intently, nodding occasionally as he jotted down notes. When I finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "This is a tricky case," he admitted, "but not impossible. The key will be proving that you never consented to the HOA's authority, and based on what you've told me, I think we can build a strong argument." He outlined a plan of action, which included filing a counterclaim against the HOA, subpoenaing their records, and preparing for the possibility of a trial. It wouldn't be easy, he warned, and it wouldn't be cheap. But if we succeeded, we could set a powerful precedent that would protect not only me, but others in similar situations. Leaving Mark's office that day, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but I was ready to take them on. This wasn't just about defending my right to paint a flag on my barn anymore. It was about standing up for the fundamental freedoms that make this country great. With determination, perseverance, and the support of my community, I was confident we could prevail. Little did I know, the battle was only just beginning. The decision to fight back against the HOA wasn't made lightly. It required a level of resolve that I didn't fully realize I possessed, until I found myself staring down the barrel of legal threats and mounting pressure. This was no longer just about me. It was about standing up for principles bigger than my little ranch in Texas. It was about defending the idea that individual freedom, self-expression, and patriotism should not be sacrificed at the altar of uniformity or bureaucratic control. As daunting as the task ahead seemed, I knew deep down that backing down would mean losing something far more valuable than a painted barn: my dignity, my independence, and my right to live life on my own terms. Gathering evidence. The first step toward justice. The first order of business was gathering evidence to support my case. I knew instinctively that the HOA's claims of authority over my property were shaky at best, but proving it would require more than gut feelings. It would take hard facts. So I rolled up my sleeves and started digging into decades' worth of documents related to the land. My grandfather had purchased the ranch outright in the 1960s, long before the concept of mandatory homeowners associations even existed in our area. If I could demonstrate that that HOA hadn't been around when we acquired the property, and that we'd never formally joined or consented to their rules, I might have a fighting chance. I spent hours combing through old deeds, titles, and tax records stored in dusty filing cabinets and online archives. Each document felt like a piece of a puzzle, slowly revealing the history of ownership and governance tied to the land. One particularly crucial discovery came from reviewing the original purchase agreement. There was no mention of an HOA, covenant, or any governing body whatsoever. This was significant because most modern HOAs derive their power from restrictive covenants written into property deeds during the subdivision process. Without such language explicitly binding us to their rules, the HOA's claim over my property began to look increasingly tenuous. But the real breakthrough came when I uncovered documentation showing that the Prairie View HOA itself had only been established about 10 years ago, long after my family had owned the ranch. According to state law, newly formed HOAs typically cannot impose retroactive restrictions on properties unless those properties were developed under their jurisdiction. Since my ranch predated the HOA by several decades, their argument that I was automatically subject to their rules appeared legally unsound. Armed with this evidence, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could turn the tide in my favor. Building community support, strength in numbers. While I focused on building my legal defense, word of my standoff with the HOA spread throughout the community. At first, I worried that airing my grievances publicly might alienate some neighbors who valued peace and quiet above all else. But what happened instead was remarkable. People rallied around me in ways I never expected. Neighbors stopped by unannounced, offering words of encouragement and sharing stories of their own struggles with the HOA. Some brought food, others offered financial contributions, to help cover my mounting legal fees, and many promised to attend court hearings if needed. One neighbor, Tom, summed it up perfectly when he said, "This isn't just about your flag anymore. It's about whether we let them dictate how we live our lives." His words struck a chord with me. For so long, the HOA had operated with impunity, enforcing arbitrary rules without much pushback. People paid their fines, repainted their doors, and trimmed their hedges, not because they agreed with the policies, but because fighting back felt too risky or exhausting. Now, seeing someone stand up to the HOA inspired others to speak out. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now happening openly, fueling a growing sense of collective resistance. Local media outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach beyond the immediate community. Reporters framed the conflict as a clash between personal liberty and institutional overreach, dubbing it the Great Flag Debate. Social media exploded with hashtags like #FreeTheFlag and #StandWithPatriots, drawing attention from across the country. Strangers sent messages of solidarity, donated money, and even offered pro bono legal advice. What began as a private dispute between me and the HOA evolved into a national conversation about the limits of authority and the importance of protecting individual freedoms. #Preparing for battle. Navigating legal waters. With public support swelling and key pieces of evidence in hand, I turned my focus to preparing for the inevitable courtroom showdown. Mark Reynolds, my attorney, became a trusted ally in navigating the complex legal landscape. Together, we crafted a strategy designed to expose the flaws in the HOA's arguments while emphasizing the constitutional protections surrounding free speech and property rights. Our primary argument rested on two pillars. First, we contended that the HOA lacked legitimate authority over my property due to the absence of any formal agreement or covenant connecting us to their organization. By providing historical documents proving the ranch predated the HOA's formation, we aimed to dismantle their jurisdictional claims entirely. Second, we'd argued that painting the American flag mural constituted a form of protected speech under the First Amendment. While the HOA maintained that aesthetic guidelines superseded such considerations, we countered that restricting patriotic symbolism amounted to censorship, a violation of fundamental freedoms enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. To bolster our case, Mark advised me to keep meticulous records of every interaction with the HOA, including copies of letters, emails, and phone calls. He also suggested documenting the mural itself, taking high-resolution photographs and videos to showcase its artistic merit and symbolic significance. These visual aids would serve as powerful tools in court, helping to humanize the issue and underscore the absurdity of penalizing someone for displaying the American flag. Despite feeling confident in our legal strategy, the emotional toll of the battle weighed heavily on me. Every new letter from the HOA, every deadline looming closer, and every dollar spent on legal fees gnawed at my resolve. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispering insidious thoughts like, "Is this really worth it?" Or, "What if we lose?" But then I'd glance out the window at the barn, its bold red, white, and blue colors standing tall against the horizon, and I'd remember why I started this fight in the first place. This wasn't just about winning. It was about sending a message that freedom matters, even if it comes at a cost. A symbol of resistance. The barn becomes a beacon. As the weeks turned into months, the barn transformed from a simple structure into a symbol of defiance and unity. Passers-by honked their horns in support as they drove past, and kids from nearby schools organized fundraisers to help cover my expenses. One day, a group of veterans showed up at my doorstep, saluting the mural and thanking me for standing up for what they saw as a sacred emblem of national pride. Their visit reminded me that this struggle transcended personal grievances. It was about preserving the values that define us as Americans. Even opponents of the HOA who lived farther away joined the cause, organizing protests and circulating petitions demanding accountability from the organization. Local businesses displayed signs reading "Support the Ranch" in their windows, and radio hosts dedicated entire segments to discussing the broader implications of the case. The momentum grew exponentially, turning what could have been a solitary battle into a grassroots movement fueled by shared outrage and determination. Through it all, the mural remained untouched, a testament to resilience and courage. Each brushstroke represented not only my love for my country, but also my refusal to bow to unjust authority. And though the road ahead promised uncertainty, one thing was clear: I was no longer fighting alone. With a community standing beside me, a team of supporters cheering me on, and a nation watching closely, I stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. The day finally arrived when the dispute between me and the Prairie View Homeowners Association, HOA, moved from heated letters and community debates into the formal, cold environment of a courtroom. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, a culmination of months of preparation, stress, and determination. The stakes were high, not just for me personally, but also for the broader questions of freedom, property rights, and self-expression that this case had come to symbolize. As I walked through the courthouse doors, flanked by my attorney, Mark Reynolds, and a small group of supporters who had traveled to show their solidarity, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what we were about to undertake. Setting the stage, a clash of arguments. From the outset, it was clear that this trial would hinge on two central issues: whether the HOA had legitimate authority over my property, and whether their enforcement of aesthetic guidelines infringed upon my constitutional rights. These questions framed every argument presented in court, with each side digging in its heels and presenting its case with unyielding conviction. The HOA's legal team opened their presentation by emphasizing the importance of maintaining community standards and preserving property values within the neighborhood. They argued that homeowners associations exist precisely to ensure uniformity and harmony among residents, which they claimed benefits everyone involved. Their lawyer, a polished man in an expensive suit, spoke confidently as he cited clauses from the HOA's governing documents, pointing out sections that outlined architectural guidelines and penalties for violations. He stressed that all members of the community, including those who hadn't explicitly joined, were bound by these rules simply because their properties fell within the designated boundaries. When it came to the mural itself, the HOA framed it as a violation of their aesthetic policies rather than a patriotic act. To them, the flag was irrelevant. What mattered was that I had altered the exterior appearance of my barn without prior approval. In their view, this lack of compliance disrupted the visual cohesion of the area and set a dangerous precedent for other homeowners to disregard the rules. They even went so far as to argue that allowing such displays could lead to chaos, an endless parade of garish decorations and conflicting designs that would undermine the very fabric of the community. Our defense, led by Mark Reynolds, took a starkly different approach. From the moment he stood up to address the judge, his tone was calm yet resolute, reflecting the gravity of the principles at stake. He began by dismantling the HOA's claim of jurisdiction over my property, presenting the historical documents I'd uncovered during my research. Using enlarged copies of deeds, titles, and tax records, he methodically demonstrated that my family's ownership of the ranch predated the formation of the HOA by decades. Without any signed agreements or restrictive covenants tying us to their organization, he argued, the HOA's assertion of authority amounted to nothing more than an overreach of power. Mark then pivoted to the heart of the matter: the American flag mural. With passion and precision, he contended that painting the flag was not merely an aesthetic choice, but a profound expression of patriotism and free speech. Drawing on First Amendment jurisprudence, he reminded the court that the U.S. Constitution protects symbolic acts of expression, including the display of national symbols. While the HOA insisted that private communities have the right to enforce reasonable restrictions, Mark countered that those restrictions cannot override fundamental freedoms guaranteed by law. He posed a rhetorical question to the judge: if a homeowner can be penalized for displaying the stars and stripes, where do we draw the line? Are we prepared to sacrifice liberty on the altar of conformity? Crossfire, legal maneuvers, and counterarguments. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a battleground of competing ideologies. Both sides lobbed arguments back and forth, each attempting to sway the judge toward their interpretation of the facts. The HOA's lawyers doubled down on their position, arguing that private communities operate under unique legal frameworks that allow them to regulate behavior in ways public entities cannot. They cited precedents involving disputes between homeowners and HOAs, highlighting cases where courts upheld the organization's authority to enforce aesthetic guidelines. According to them, living within the HOA's boundaries implied consent to abide by their rules, even if no formal membership agreement existed. In response, Mark skillfully dissected their arguments, exposing inconsistencies and weaknesses. For example, he pointed out that many of the cases cited by the HOA involved developments created specifically under the auspices of an HOA, with restrictive covenants baked into the original deeds. My situation, however, was fundamentally different. The ranch predates the HOA entirely, making their retroactive application of rules legally dubious. Furthermore, he emphasized that the HOA's focus on aesthetics ignored the deeper significance of the mural. By reducing the flag to a mere design element, they trivialized its meaning and dismissed the values it represented. At one point, the HOA's lead attorney attempted to discredit the notion that the mural qualified as protected speech. He argued that the First Amendment applies primarily to government actions, not disputes between private parties like this one. Mark anticipated this line of reasoning and countered with a nuanced explanation of how constitutional protections extend beyond direct state intervention. Citing landmark Supreme Court rulings, he explained that while the First Amendment doesn't directly bind private organizations, courts often interpret it broadly to safeguard expressions of identity and belief, especially when those expressions carry cultural or political weight. Painting the American flag, he argued, was inherently tied to core democratic ideals and therefore deserving of heightened protection. Emotional testimony. Voices of support. Midway through the proceedings, the judge allowed testimony from witnesses called by both sides. This phase brought a human dimension to the legal arguments, grounding the abstract concepts of jurisdiction and free speech in real-life experiences. On behalf of the HOA, several neighbors testified about their concerns regarding property values and the potential impact of nonconforming modifications on the community's appeal. One woman described feeling unsettled by the mural, claiming it clashed with the rustic charm of the surrounding landscape. Another neighbor expressed frustration over perceived double standards, noting that others in the area had faced fines for much smaller infractions. But the most powerful testimonies came from my supporters. Tom, the neighbor who had shared his own struggles with the HOA, spoke eloquently about the chilling effect of unchecked authority. He recounted how years of intimidation and micromanagement had stifled creativity and fostered resentment among residents. What starts as a rule about paint colors, he said, ends up being a rule about how you live your life. His words resonated deeply, capturing the essence of why so many people viewed this case as more than just a personal vendetta. It was a stand against systemic overreach. Another witness, a retired Marine who had visited my ranch earlier in the saga, delivered an impassioned statement about the symbolism of the American flag. Fighting back tears, he described serving overseas and seeing fellow soldiers risk their lives to defend the freedoms embodied by that banner. To him, punishing someone for displaying it felt like a betrayal of everything America stands for. His testimony left the courtroom silent, underscoring the emotional resonance of the issue at hand. Closing arguments, framing the verdict. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides delivered closing arguments that encapsulated their respective positions. The HOA's lawyer reiterated the importance of order and consistency, framing the mural as a threat to the delicate balance required to maintain property values. He urged the judge to uphold the organization's authority, warning that ruling in my favor would open the floodgates for unchecked individualism and erode the foundation of communal living. Mark, however, painted a very different picture. Standing before the bench, he appealed not only to the letter of the law, but also to the spirit of justice. He reminded the court that this case wasn't just about a flag or a barn. It was about the kind of society we want to live in. Freedom isn't always neat or orderly, he said. Sometimes it's messy and inconvenient. But it's worth protecting, especially when it comes to expressing love for our country. His final words hung in the air, a poignant reminder of the stakes involved. Waiting for justice. Reflections on the process. After hours of deliberation, the judge announced that she would take the matter under advisement and render her decision at a later date. As we filed out of the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful. The legal battle may have been exhausting, but it had also been empowering. Whether we won or lost, I knew that standing up for my beliefs and inspiring others to do the same was a victory in its own right. In the days that followed, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. What started as a simple act of patriotism had grown into something far greater, a fight for autonomy, dignity, and the enduring values that define us as Americans. Whatever the outcome, I felt proud to have taken a stand, not just for myself, but for everyone who believes in the power of freedom. The weeks following the trial were a blur of anticipation, reflection, and quiet resolve. After months of preparation, legal wrangling, and emotional upheaval, the final verdict from the judge was imminent. The waiting period felt interminable, each day stretching longer than the last as I replayed every moment of the trial in my mind. With the court side with me, affirming my right to express myself freely on my own property, or would that HOA's relentless push for conformity prevail, setting a dangerous precedent for others like me? The uncertainty weighed heavily, but amidst it all, I found solace in knowing that no matter the outcome, I had fought with integrity, and that alone was worth celebrating. The verdict, a triumph of freedom. When the decision finally came, it arrived not with fanfare or ceremony, but quietly, through a formal court order delivered via email. My heart raced as I opened the attachment, scanning the document line by line. And then I saw it, the words I had hoped for. The plaintiff's claims are hereby dismissed. The judge ruled unequivocally in my favor, rejecting the HOA's lawsuit and affirming my rights as a property owner. In her written opinion, she dismantled the HOA's arguments piece by piece, citing both the lack of jurisdiction over my land and the constitutional protections surrounding free speech. Her ruling was clear and decisive. First, she noted that because my family's ownership of the ranch predated the formation of the HOA, their restrictive covenants could not retroactively apply to my property. Without explicit consent or agreement, the HOA had no legal standing to enforce its rules against me. Second, she addressed the issue of the mural itself, stating that painting the American flag constituted a legitimate form of symbolic expression protected under the First Amendment. While private communities do have some latitude to regulate aesthetics, she emphasized that such authority does not extend to suppressing acts of patriotism or stifling individual freedoms. As I read through the ruling, tears welled up in my eyes, not just tears of relief, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the judge's wisdom, for Mark Reynolds' tireless advocacy, and for the countless supporters who had stood by me throughout this ordeal. This victory wasn't mine alone. It belonged to everyone who believed in the principles of liberty, self-expression, and justice. It was a win not only for my ranch, but for anyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of institutional overreach. Celebrating the win. A community united. News of the verdict spread quickly, igniting celebrations across the community. Neighbors gathered at my ranch that evening, bringing food, drinks, and stories of their own babbles with the HOA. Someone strung up twinkling lights around the barn, casting a warm glow over the now iconic mural. Kids ran around playing games while adults toasted to freedom and perseverance. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of joy, vindication, and renewed hope for the future. One particularly touching moment came when Tom, the neighbor who had spoken so passionately during the trial, presented me with a framed photo of the mural. Beneath it, he'd written a simple inscription, "To standing firm and inspiring us all." His gesture encapsulated the spirit of solidarity that had carried me through the darkest days of the fight. Other neighbors chimed in with heartfelt thanks, sharing how witnessing my courage had inspired them to confront their own fears and stand up for what they believed in. Local media outlets covered the celebration extensively, framing the verdict as a landmark decision with far-reaching implications. Journalists highlighted the broader significance of the case, noting how it underscored the tension between individual rights and collective governance. Social media exploded once again, with hashtags like #FreedomWins trending nationwide. Messages poured in from strangers across the country, congratulating me and expressing admiration for refusing to back down. What had started as a personal dispute had become a symbol of resistance, a testament to the enduring power of standing up for one's beliefs. Reflections on the journey. Lessons learned. In the aftermath of the victory, I took time to reflect on everything I had learned throughout this journey. The experience had been transformative, reshaping not only my perspective on property rights and free speech, but also my understanding of community, resilience, and the meaning of true freedom. One of the most profound lessons was the importance of persistence. There were moments during the fight when doubt crept in, whispering insidious thoughts about whether it was all worth it. But looking back, I realized that giving up would have meant surrendering not just the mural, but also the values it represented. Perseverance isn't always glamorous. It often involves long hours, sleepless nights, and sacrifices. But it is essential for achieving meaningful change. Standing firm in the face of adversity is how we grow stronger, both individually and collectively. Another key takeaway was the power of community. When I first received that fateful letter from the HOA, I felt isolated, as though I were fighting an unwinnable battle alone. But as word spread and neighbors rallied around me, I discovered the incredible strength that comes from unity. People from all walks of life, farmers, veterans, teachers, business owners, came together to support a cause greater than themselves. Their solidarity reminded me that even in the face of overwhelming odds, we are never truly alone if we choose to stand with others. The role of storytelling also became apparent during this process. By sharing my story openly and honestly, I was able to spark conversations about issues that might otherwise have remained hidden. Whether through interviews with reporters, posts on social media, or casual chats with neighbors, my willingness to speak out helped shine a light on the systemic problems plaguing many homeowners associations. Stories have a unique ability to connect people, fostering empathy and inspiring action. They remind us that behind every policy or rule, there are real lives being affected, and that those voices deserve to be heard. Finally, this experience reinforced my faith in the judicial system, at least in its capacity to deliver justice when given the opportunity. While navigating the legal labyrinth was exhausting and expensive, seeing the judge uphold the Constitution and protect individual freedoms restored my belief in the rule of law. It served as a powerful reminder that our system, though imperfect, can still function as a check against abuse of power when wielded wisely. Looking ahead, a legacy of resistance. With the legal battle behind me, I turned my attention to the future. The victory against the HOA didn't just resolve my immediate conflict, it opened doors for others facing similar challenges. Inspired by the outcome of my case, several neighbors began exploring ways to reform or even dissolve restrictive HOAs in their areas. Some launched petitions calling for greater transparency and accountability within these organizations, while others sought legal advice to challenge questionable policies. The ripple effects of our success extended far beyond my little corner of Texas, igniting a movement toward more equitable and inclusive forms of community governance. On a personal level, the mural continued to serve as a daily reminder of the values I hold dear: freedom, independence, and pride in being American. Every time I looked at it, I thought not just of the struggle it represented, but also of the triumph it embodied. It stood as a beacon of hope, a testament to the idea that sometimes standing your ground can spark change far greater than you ever imagined. And yet, the journey wasn't entirely over. The HOA, stung by their defeat, hinted at the possibility of appealing the decision or pursuing other avenues to reclaim control. While I remained vigilant, preparing for any further attempts to undermine my rights, I also focused on building bridges within the community. Healing divisions and fostering mutual respect would take time, but I believed it was possible if we approached each other with openness and humility. A final thought: the power of standing up. Looking back on the entire saga, from the first brushstroke of paint on the barn to the final gavel strike in court, I am struck by how much this experience changed me. It taught me that freedom isn't something we inherit passively. It's something we must actively defend, even when doing so feels daunting or risky. It showed me that small acts of defiance, like painting a flag on a barn, can ignite larger movements, uniting people around shared values and aspirations. Most importantly, it reminded me that the fight for liberty is ongoing, requiring constant vigilance and unwavering commitment. Today, as I watch the sun set over the fields and cast golden hues across the mural, I feel a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the victory, but for the journey that led me here. It was messy, exhausting, and at times painful, but it was also profoundly rewarding. Because in the end, it wasn't just about saving a barn or preserving a flag. It was about proving that freedom matters, that it's worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And that lesson, more than anything else, will stay with me forever.